Hey, y'all. It is Wednesday, April 17th, and this is Treasure Christ Today. My name's John Michael, the lead pastor here at the Bridge Church in Miamisburg, Ohio. We exist by God's grace to spread God's gospel for God's glory. Thanks for joining us again. Today we're in 1 Kings chapter 5 and 6 as we continue studying God's presence on earth, and we developing the theme through the Old Testament this week of from the tabernacle to the temple and then onward after that. All right, read with us starting in verse 1, chapter 5. King Hiram of Tyre sent his emissaries to Solomon when he heard that he had been anointed king in his father's place. For Hiram had always been friends with David. Solomon sent this message to Hiram: "You know my father David was not able to build a temple for the name of the Lord his God. This was because of all the warfare all around him until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. The Lord my God has now given me rest on every side. There is no enemy or misfortune. So I plan to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, according to what the Lord promised my father David. I will put your son on your throne in your place, and he will build the temple for my name. Therefore, command that cedars from Lebanon be cut down for me. My servants will be your servants, and I will pay your servants wages according to whatever you say. For you know that not a man among us knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians." When Hiram heard Solomon's words, he rejoiced greatly and said, "Blessed be the Lord today. He has given David a wise son to be over this great people." Then Hiram sent a reply to Solomon saying, "I have heard your message. I will do everything you want regarding the cedar and cypress timber. My servants will bring the logs down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will make them into rafts to go by sea to the place you indicate. I will break them apart there, and you can take them away. You can then meet my needs by providing my household with food." So Hiram provided Solomon with all the cedar and cypress timber he wanted, and Solomon provided Hiram with 120,000 bushels of wheat as food for his household and 120,000 gallons of oil from crushed olives. Solomon did this for Hiram year after year. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised. There was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. Then King Solomon drafted forced laborers from all Israel. The labor force numbered 30,000 men. He sent 10,000 to Lebanon each month in shifts. 1 month they were in Lebanon, 2 months they were at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 porters and 80,000 stonecutters in the mountains, not including his 3,300 deputies in charge of the work. They supervised the people doing the work. The king commanded them to quarry large, costly stones to lay the foundations of the temple with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders, along with the Gebalites, quarried the stone and prepared the timber and stone for the temple's construction. Solomon began to build the temple for the Lord in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of his reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The portico in front of the temple sanctuary was 30 feet long, extending across the temple's width and 15 feet deep in front of the temple. He also made windows from beveled frames for the temple. He then built a chambered structure along the temple wall, encircling the walls of the temple, that is, the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary, and he made side chambers all around. The lowest chamber was 7.5 feet wide, the middle was 9 feet wide, and the third was 10.5 feet wide. He also provided offset ledges for the temple all around the outside so that nothing would be inserted into the temple walls. The temple's construction used finished stones cut at the quarry so that no hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. The door for the lowest side chamber was on the right side of the temple. They went up a stairway to the middle chamber and from the middle to the third. When he finished building the temple, he paneled it with boards and planks of cedar. He built the chambers along the entire temple, joined to the temple with cedar beams. Each story was 7.5 feet high. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for the temple you are building, if you walk in my statutes, observe my ordinances, and keep all my commands by walking in them, I will fulfill my promise to you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the Israelites and not abandon my people. When Solomon finished building the temple, he paneled the interior temple walls with cedar boards from the temple floor to the surface of the ceiling. He overlaid the interior with wood. He also overlaid the floor with cypress boards. Then he lined 30 feet of the rear of the temple with cedar boards from the floor to the surface of the ceiling. And he built the interior as an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. The temple, that is, the sanctuary in front of the most holy place, was 60 feet long. The cedar paneling inside the temple was carved with ornamental gourds and flower blossoms. Everything was cedar, not a stone could be seen. He prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple to put the Ark of the Lord's covenant there. The interior of the sanctuary was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet high. He overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid the cedar altar. Next, Solomon overlaid the interior of the temple with pure gold. And he hung gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, and he overlaid it with gold. So he added the gold overlay to the entire temple until everything was completely finished, including the entire altar that belongs to the inner sanctuary. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim, 15 feet high, out of olive wood. One wing of the first cherub was 7.5 feet long, and the other wing was 7.5 feet long, and the wingspan was 15 feet from tip to tip. The second cherub was also 15 feet. Both cherubim had the same size and shape, and the first cherub's height was 15 feet, and so was the second cherub's. Then he put the cherubim inside the inner temple. Since their wings were spread out, the first one's wing touched one wall, while the second cherub's wing touched the other wall, and in the middle of the temple their wings were touching wing to wing. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold, and he carved all the surrounding temple walls with carved engravings, cherubim, palm trees, and flower blossoms. In the inner and outer sanctuaries, he overlaid the temple floor with gold. In both the inner and the outer sanctuaries, for the entrance of the temple or the inner sanctuary, he made olive wood doors. The pillars of the doorposts were 5-sided, and the 2 doors were made of olive wood, and he carved cherubim, palm trees, and flower blossoms on them and overlaid them with gold, hammering gold over the cherubim and palm trees. In the same way, he made 4-sided olive wood doorpost for the sanctuary entrance. The 2 doors were made of cypress wood. The first door had 2 folding sides, and the second door had 2 folding panels, and he carved cherubim, palm trees, and flower blossoms on them, and overlaid them with gold applied evenly over the carving. He built the inner courtyard with 3 rows of dressed stone and a row of trimmed cedar beams. The foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in Solomon's 4th year in the month of Ziv. In his 11th year in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the temple was completed in every detail and according to every specification, so he built it in 7 years. This is the word of the Lord. Here in 1 Kings 5 and 6, we encounter the time period right after King David passed away and King Solomon, his son, becomes the king. And immediately Solomon puts his hand to the task of doing that which his father desired to do, but the Lord did not allow him to do because of the bloodshed that was on his hand. And the Lord promised to David that his son would rise up and build the temple. And so Solomon determines to build the temple to honor the Lord and for the name of the Lord. And so he sends a message to King Hiram of Tyre, the King Hiram of the Sidonians, who is ruling over the land of Lebanon, and he asked for Tyre to send wood, to send the cedars of Lebanon to be cut down and to be sent to build up the temple. And King Hiram agrees, and he participates in this at the cost of giving them food. Apparently, there probably was a small famine in the land, and so the Sidonians needed food. And so there was a trade that occurred between the Israelites and the king of Tyre. And so they traded for the cedar trees and the cypress trees, and also for the stone to be cut. And so here we find that the Lord blesses the hand of Solomon as he seeks to strike a treaty with Tyre to build the temple for the Lord. Now, what's interesting here is a detail that in verse 13, King Solomon drafted forced laborers from all of Israel. It's not how God designs his kings to be. In fact, God warned people through Samuel when they demanded a king, and first Saul would become, that God warned them that this is the type of actions that a king would do over them. A king would bring their kids, their sons, and their daughters, and would force them into labor. And so we find here Solomon forcing this tremendous workforce, drafting over 30,000 men to be into this workforce to build the temple. And as he drafts them, he sends them to go work quarrying large, costly stones to lay the foundation for the temple. Now, Solomon begins building the temple. Chapter 6 tells us in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt. And so now, in the month of Ziv, the second month of the year, in the 480th year, Solomon sets forth to building the temple. Now, in the midst of this chapter 6, we find the tremendous details of all of the measurements of the temple. We find the measurements of the outer buildings, we find measurements of the sanctuary, and we find measurements of the inner sanctuary, the most holy place. We find the details of how they built them with wood and then overlaid them with gold and carved into them these images of the cherubim and the flower blossoms and the pomegranates that are there. And we see in this sanctuary, what's interesting, a detail of this sanctuary reminds us of the Garden of Eden. Because Garden of Eden was where God walked with man and dwelt with man. And so now the temple will be the place in which God meets with his people. And so there is this garden-like imagery on the walls all around it. It was in the garden that after God kicked them out of the garden, that God set up a cherubim to guard the entrance of the garden. And so the temple has these images of the cherubim guarding the presence of God. Now, this has to be an incredible sight to see this building that is overlaid with gold everywhere. But I want you to focus with me and look in 1 Kings 6 into the center section of this chapter. In verse 11, there is a word of the Lord that comes to Solomon. And this is the most important word, because the temple wasn't just to be an incredible sight on the outside by this external display of all of this gold. No, the thing that mattered for the temple was whether God's presence was there. And the Lord says in verse 12, "As for this temple you are building, if you walk in my statutes and observe my ordinances, keep all of my commands by walking in them, I will fulfill my promise to you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the Israelites and not abandon my people Israel." What matters most is not building for God a temple of gold. What matters most is walking in the statutes and ordinances and commands that God has given, walking in a right relationship with God. And what we see through the history of Israel, and we see in the life of Solomon, is that by the end of Solomon's life, Solomon disobeys God's statutes, ordinances, and commands. And by the end of his life, he doesn't look as much like a king of Israel. He looks more like a pharaoh of Egypt in the actions that he takes. And so it is with God's people. And because of that, God doesn't dwell with his people here in the temple forever. We're going to eventually encounter the story and when God's presence leaves the temple in the book of Ezekiel as God sends his people into exile. So here's the question for you and I today. Is that the case for us as well today? God, does he care about gold overlaid church buildings and church buildings that are basically these mighty, impressive structures? And we think if we build these structures, God will come to dwell within them. No, he comes to dwell with those who trust him, those who look to Jesus Christ and those who obey his word. Those who follow Jesus, those are the ones to whom he dwells with, those who are lowly in spirit and humble in heart. And so here's the question for you and I today. Do we treasure Jesus Christ and walk by God's Spirit with him every single day? That is what we desire to do here in Treasure Christ today. Love you guys. I hope you'll come back and join us tomorrow for 1 Kings 7 through 9. Grace and peace.